Folks on Zoom. Just a quick recap of what we're doing today. So this morning we have the dialogue. Then we're having a community building lunch where we can talk about things that we learned, or just get to know each other, just build community, build relationships, or spend the idea of thinking about what we heard in the morning. And then in the afternoon, for those who can stay, we're having our workshop, where we're going to engage in challenging conversations around anti-oppressive lens. So before we start our first session here, we're going to do a land acknowledgement. I'll turn it over to my colleague for that, and then we'll come back and introduce ourselves.
Hi everyone, great to be with you all today. I'm hoping to start us off in a good way, as Dana Lynn always says, with a land acknowledgement. My name's Erin. I grew up on Squamish territory in what is now called North Van, and together we're gathered here on the unceded, ancestral, and traditional Musqueam territory. I'm very grateful to work and learn here and to learn from this land. And in preparation for today, I was thinking about how spring is coming around the corner here, and we're starting to see those crocuses pop up, and that always gives me a sense of joy. And, like clockwork, there's a cold, wet winter that we always have around here that eventually turns into a pretty warm and hopeful spring. And sometimes when we discuss issues like racism and colonialism, it feels like a bit of a dark winter, a set of never-ending problems that can feel pretty hopeless at times. And I'm hoping that today we can align ourselves with this change of season, find some hope in our conversations together. And I appreciate that we're able to gather here today on Musqueam land to both experience the sense of renewal and vitality of the change of seasons, and also towards our own commitments to learning and engaging with anti-racism. I hope that today in some way serves to make us better visitors here and better neighbors. So thank you.
Thank you, Erin. That was lovely. Wonderful to start us off in a good way. So here is our agenda for the day, or for this first session, sorry. So we've had the welcome, land acknowledgement. We're going to now do some introductions. Bashir is going to lead us through group norms. I will do the first 15-minute piece on worldviews and two-eyed seeing. Then Bashir will do the next piece on experiences of racialized people in Canada. And then Erin will do the principles that guide allyship. We will have an all-group discussion and a wrap-up. So this part isn't as interactive. It's a little bit more lecture-y, a little bit more listening, but we're going to have time to really dive into things in our workshop this afternoon. We also will have questions at the end and opportunity to talk over lunch and enjoy and have that informal learning and being together. My smiling face. So I'm Dana Lynn McKenzie. I use she, her pronouns. Senior Manager of EDI in both the Faculty of Applied Science and the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. My primary appointment is in Applied Science. I'm a member and an elected councillor of my First Nation, the Hulitsum First Nation, based in Canoe Pass, which is between Ladner and Steveston, that body of water, in British Columbia. And I will turn it over to my colleague.
Hi everyone. I'm Erin. I work with Dana Lynn and Bashir as the Indigenous Engagement Coordinator for APSI. I'm really excited to be here, and I hope today is a great day. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bashir.
It's like musical chairs.
Yeah, it really is.
Hey everyone, my name is Bashir. My pronouns are he and him. I'm the EDI Coordinator for the Faculty of Applied Science. And I'll just begin by going through group norms. If you don't know what group norms is, it's basically just kind of our mutual contract on how we want to engage with each other today. So I'll toss a couple of things down on the whiteboard. The first is kind of a basic one. If you have a phone on you, just put it on silent, if that's okay. The second one is if you need to leave, just kind of give us some sort of acknowledgement that you're okay. Because the stuff we're talking about may be a little intense, and it's okay to take a moment for yourself, but just let us know if it's just a washroom break. But aside from that, does anyone have any other group norms they would like to add? No? You're all good? Well, another group norm I'll add is if you want to add to the group norms, you can do so at any point. Just raise your hand during intermission and feel free to bring it up. So I'll write those 2 points, and as I'm writing, if anything comes up, feel free to just say it. So phone's on vibrate. And just a check-in if you're leaving. Dadelin, Aaron, do you have anything to add, or feeling pretty good? Okay, I guess we can just jump into it.
Okay, so we're going to discuss worldviews and 2IC. This may be a review for some of you, it may be something really new. But to me, this really helps ground a lot of the ways we think about things, how we engage with cultures other than our own, how we think about things, for example, the Indigenous Strategic Plan and how it affects our work. So we'll jump right into it. So worldviews, what are worldviews? Well, they're the attitudes, the values, the stories, they are the beliefs we hold. They're how we order our lives. Our worldviews inform us about what is important or what is less important for just our functioning. We think a lot about worldviews because they really help us navigate the world in a coherent way. They also create biases that go unnoticed because we just assume that our reality is so entrenched, our worldview is so entrenched in our reality that, sometimes these assumptions are helpful, but sometimes they're not. For example, we know red usually means danger. If we see a red light, we stop. That keeps us safe. That helps us cross the road. But other things, they do sort of play into stereotypes of different groups. We sometimes have these biases and unconsciously think that maybe another group is lesser than we are, or more dangerous, or more pejorative in the way that they're stereotyped. Philosophers have spent centuries examining this topic. The dominant worldview in Canada is what we call a Western worldview. And in this view, we think about things as a hierarchy, with humans at the top. The pyramid here is a way to illustrate this. So rocks and earth are at the bottom, insects are at the bottom, and then we move up towards fish, fowl, and then mammals, and then the humans at the top. We also think about cultures and religions this way. We think of less developed cultures, what we think of as less developed cultures, maybe along the bottom, and the more developed areas and people at the top. We can refine this in a spiritual sense as well, with the least spiritual at the top and the most spiritual at the bottom. When we think about other groups, other religions, this often comes into play with our worldviews. We also think about time in a worldview sense, in a Western worldview sense. We think about now. Gratification is now. So we have really strong inherent and explicit biases depending on our worldviews, and we talk about civilization as being this pinnacle of the pyramid. We describe things as civilized. I'll get to that in a minute. Well, actually, let's go into it now. We think about British accents. We think about high fashion, expensive cars, high tea. All these things are expressions of a civilized world, right? Media, popular culture reinforces this belief. James Bond drinking martinis, surrounded by Bond girls, driving high-performance cars in Monaco. These are what we call civilization. And this is the media, social norms, popular culture, they really reinforce this view. But let's examine these things. What is this? What is this telling us? This is really talking about a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant man, often with a British accent, moneyed, comfortable hobnobbing with people like the Queen in the 2012 Olympics. This is how tropes are developed. This idea of the white savior. So then we come into this other image, you know, the less attractive and less valued worth of other ways of knowing. The movie Avatar really explores this and exploits this really well to a high degree. So we have a white man coming into an indigenous culture to help exploit the resources or to help save it. And he is the only one, despite the people living in this make-believe world for a millennium, he can spend a couple days and figure out their system and find a way to save it. He is actually wearing indigeneity as his disguise. And this is shocking. You know, this type of worldview, this valuing of civilization, it really doesn't leave much room for Indigenous, Black, people of color. It doesn't leave much room for women, other than objects being prized and only certain shapes of objects. So we see that other less dominant worldviews, they don't get the space or the value that they deserve in Canada because we're so entrenched and so reinforced in our Western worldview. And because we live in Canada, I'm going to focus on a different worldview, which is an Indigenous worldview. But this does not mean that other cultures, other areas have worldviews that are lesser or we're not going to talk about them. But on the interest of time, this is what I'm going to base. So what is an Indigenous worldview? So let's go back to our little slide here. An Indigenous worldview is circular, it's holistic, it's not hierarchical. Time is not static. Plants, mammals, earth, humans, they all exist as equals. The ancestors who came before and the generations that are yet to be are also very key in this worldview. Nothing is more or less than the other thing. Everything has value. Respect, reciprocity, relevance, responsibility, these are all key ideas that an Indigenous worldview hold that guide our research, that guide our work. And in Canada, as we know, the state has too long silenced Indigenous culture, Indigenous legal orders, Indigenous rights through legislation and politics. And because now we are in Canada, we are at this university, it is everybody's job to engage in decolonization and indigenization. This is not just the job for Indigenous folks. Indigenous folks already know how to do this. It is the job for everyone else to engage in these things. And it's really important to see differences in these systems for what they are and how they create or perpetuate barriers. Worldviews deserve to be examined, and we need to deliberately and critically engage with these systems that we hold immovable, because the worldviews really shape how everything works for us. So an Indigenous worldview, we talk about spiritually based. The system really holds that as part of the thing. There are many truths. Truths are dependent upon individual and collective experiences. Everything and everyone is related. So sometimes you will hear people say, oh, my relations, or my friends and relations. So it's this understanding that we are all connected. And the land, of course, is sacred. And it's usually given by the Creator. And the acknowledgement and our place within the land, our valuing of the resources, our stewardship of the land is incredibly important. In contrast, the Western worldview is very fact-based, and we try to think that it's not biased. But of course, we are creating it. We are perpetuating it. So it holds all of our biases within it. So the scientific unbiased view is a little bit of a myth. We also think in a Western or a European worldview that there is only one truth, and that society is divided and hierarchical, and that the resources, the land, everything is there for us to exploit and for us to use now, and that our idea of the generations coming after, the ancestors that came before, the 7 generations sort of thinking across, it usually doesn't come into play. We think about what our impact is now, what we're doing right now, and how things can work. We don't often spend our time wrestling with what this will look like in 100 years or 200 years when we make decisions. And the idea is that, of course, as humans, we are superior, we're at the top of the pyramid, and the resources and everything is there for our benefit. There is strength in difference, and as I mentioned, there are many other worldviews. I'm only focusing on the 2 because we're in Canada and because we're at this university, and the ISP, the Indigenous Strategic Plan, is an incredibly important tool that the university has asked us to engage with. But we do know that diversity builds stronger teams, diverse thought, diverse thinking, diverse worldviews, they benefit everything that we do. And there's a lot of value in that. Why do we talk about worldviews when we're talking about anti-oppressive work? Well, we've talked about how they shape our understanding of the world. We want to start thinking, we want to start noticing. When we think about something, we want to be able to identify its core, and that's the way we can address our biases. And that's the way we can start dismantling and start questioning and start critically engaging with the system. And that is really ultimately going to help us with our work. Again, we have this idea of researcher neutrality in the STEM field. But by claiming neutrality, by removing ourselves from the equation, we're not really making it more objective. We're just obscuring it and making it harder to identify our biases within, because everybody has biases, we all do. So we do want to challenge and notice our biases. We do want to understand who we are, what our systems of thinking are, and how we approach the world. We don't have to change our worldview, we just have to recognize that it's there. And we just have to have an openness and a mind for other things and to allow other ways of thinking to come in. Now we're going to talk a little bit about this concept of two-eyed seeing. So two-eyed seeing is a great way to reconcile different worldviews. So two-eyed seeing was designed by, it was a term coined by Elder Albert Marshall of the Eskasoni First Nation in Cape Breton, or Unamagi. Unamagi means the place where the fog rolls in Mi'kmaq. And Elder Albert Marshall and his wife, name's just slipped my mind. Anyway, sorry about that. They worked in STEM fields. They worked at Cape Breton University, both associate professors there, and they realized, you know, we need science. We need the tools that we're getting, that we're given. We need to be able to embrace the world, but we also need to pull in other things that inform our values, and we need to pull in other ways of thinking to make it better, to build on it and compound it. So they designed this idea of two-eyed seeing being a tool. So with one eye, you are looking at the world through whatever worldview you hold. And if it's the dominant Western European worldview, you're looking at the world that way. You understand the tools, you understand your research, you understand the way you work, you understand your processes. But with the other eye, it can help really make you see and make you have this idea that you can pull in your own worldview, you can pull in other people's worldviews, you can recognize that there are other worldviews out there, you can honor Indigenous worldviews, you can honor your own. And these things just strengthen the way we work, because we are no longer operating under a system where we're not questioning or critically thinking about anything, where we just take everything as a given. We actually are stepping back and realizing the way the system works, realizing our part in it, and realizing that there are other ways of doing things that are equally as valuable. As a faculty, we engage in teaching, research, service. As staff, we carry really strong objectives to our work, and sometimes we may find it really hard to incorporate other ways of doing or thinking about things. So when challenged with something like finding a caterer for an event, for example, picked randomly. We might think, well, we don't have the power to change any of these processes or systems. We're not decision makers. We have to look at what's the cheapest. We have to worry about our budget. And we have to think about the bottom line. The bottom line doesn't allow us to engage with the ISP or engage in different worldviews, right? We have a responsibility to do these things. Sometimes when we hold these ways of thinking, we're so entrenched in the system and we're so thinking about the here and now, and thinking about what makes sense in the moment in these very things. These are all very much offshoots of the Western worldview. And we are not thinking about relationships. We're not thinking about reciprocity. We're not thinking about respect or other key principles that exist in other worldviews, such as an Indigenous worldview. So when we choose catering, for example, if our guiding principle is only the cheapest, the easiest, the fastest, and we don't see any benefits beyond that, we are making choices that are disposable. They're plastic. They're uninteresting. We're choosing Walmart, basically. Hope nobody works for Walmart. Just a little. But if we choose an Indigenous caterer, it might be more expensive, but the benefits are profound in terms of respect and reciprocity, in terms of relationships. So, for example, there's a caterer I know in Musqueam, Salish and Catering. If that's something we're choosing deliberately, we're factoring building in those relationships with Musqueam. People always ask, how do we get relationships with Musqueam? Well, you give them business. You connect with them. You spend time with them. You build a relationship with them. One way. There's a very easy way. We're strengthening future relationships. We're helping people that are working for this Musqueam owned and operated business. Jobs and livelihoods depend on that choice. We're not enriching some massive corporation that doesn't care about us. We're actually getting really tangible, viable benefits that will extend beyond that one immediate choice, that will build and grow as we do things. So now when we think about what's a better choice, what's the bottom line, what benefits are we getting, it's not just about money. It's about so much else. It's about providing peace and security, a roof over people's heads. It's weighing those benefits. It's building those relationships. It's connecting with people. So all those sorts of things, when we think about our choices in terms of that, it may seem like a little choice, but it's actually a big choice. And bonus, you're meeting one of the directives of the ISP. So there you go. When you do your self-assessment reflection, you can be like, hey, I am on this. I am here. So there you go. Same decision, all sorts of different benefits. And now you can think and argue logically which one makes more sense. Other benefits of two-eyed seeing is that you're always fine-tuning your mind into different places. You're looking at other perspectives and better ways of doing things. So this illustration is a Mi'kmaq understanding, but this is one of those commonalities that appear and reappear in Indigenous cultures all throughout Canada. I am Coast Salish, I am not Mi'kmaq. I did, however, live there for a few years. So it made sense to put this in. So Mi'kmaq understanding is 7 generations. Coast Salish people don't think of generations, we think about ancestors and those yet to come. But it's very similar. It's the same sort of thing. And if you think about what that means in terms of your decision making, what that means in terms of the impacts that you're making every day, what that means in terms of your choices, when you think, oh, I'm only a staff person, I'm only involved in Excel spreadsheets. But maybe you do have other impacts. Maybe you do have other ways of addressing these sorts of things. Maybe you do have other ways of engaging with different worldviews. And these are better decisions and better ways of doing things. We can talk more about other STEM examples, mining engineering, food security, nursing, all these principles all inform this type of care. The ISP, the Indigenous Strategic Plan, it also asks us to think about hiring, retention, support, admissions, student success. You know, when we think about our jobs in finance, we have the ERSI guidelines about honoraria for elders and knowledge keepers. This is an example of ways to recognize the barriers that exist for Canada's poorest demographic and removing them. We know a lot of our elders live well below the poverty line. They don't need to be taxed on this money when they're performing a service, when they're sharing their knowledge, and they're on Musqueam land. What can help me here at UBC? I've mentioned the Indigenous Strategic Plan. There's a whole website with all kinds of tips, stories, things to do. If you haven't engaged in the self-assessment, it's a good time to go through it. Go through it yourself. Go through it with a friend. Pull a pal in that you share an office with. Talk about actually what is the Indigenous Strategic Plan asking us to do. You have a toolkit, you have all sorts of things, and it's really just to make you think critically again. What can we be doing more of? What are we doing that we can change? You know, is the bottom line really the bottom line? Or what benefits will we get out of things? And what can we start doing? Where can we start making these changes? So now we're going to give you a minute. I finished talking. And we want you to turn to the person next to you, your friend, to your right or left, and think about and reflect on this. And we're going to spend a few minutes, we'll give you 5 minutes to have a little dialogue. What ways would you integrate two-eyed seeing framework into your work right now? All right. And on Zoom, people will go into breakout rooms.
Yeah. Oh, I was saying.
So I have and yeah, I can mine too. Yeah, I made it soon.
Yeah. We don't have that in our constitution.
So I'll just let everyone wrap up their thoughts.
Yeah. Well,
I'll come back up here.
exactly. But you can't look at it. It's not going to be equal. It could be the only kind. Yeah.
Cool. Sarah and Britta are the people back from the breakout rooms. Thank you so much. And again, thanks for the admins for helping us out. So my name is Bashir. I'm the EDI coordinator for the Faculty of Applied Science. We'll be talking a little bit about the experience of racialized people in Canada. So let's kind of start with an abstract question. Who are racialized people? And I think a lot of people, they immediately go to the legal definitions, right? You know, we talk about visible minorities, and it's interesting to like really interrogate what words we use and why we use those words.
Chair Cypher, can you ask the participant?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Oh, no worries. So for example, visible minorities, a legal definition, comes from the Employment Equity Act. Aboriginal is also a legal definition. It's within our Constitution, and it's often used to describe relationships. So you notice that some Indigenous people prefer to call themselves Aboriginal for that reason. And just a question, like, are these definitions static? Like, who is an immigrant? Who is an expat? Or who is a visible minority? To give an example, in my third year at university, I got a scholarship to go and study in South Korea. And when I was there, it was interesting because, you know, a lot of people didn't see me as Canadian. It was funny, a lot of people thought I was American. And the reason for that was kind of funny because there's a lot of American soldiers in South Korea at the time. So a lot of the black people, they were black American soldiers. And it got to the point where I got a t-shirt made that said in Korean, "Miguk Samamaniyeyo," which means I am not American. And it was a great icebreaker. And it started this interesting conversation. Okay, so where are you from? And I mentioned, you know, I was born in Kenya, but I'm Canadian. And yeah, it was interesting. The perception of Canadian abroad is usually, someone who's white. Expat, for example, I think that's like a very funny term because it's basically an immigrant. Like if you think about who is an expat, again, it's often racialized, and it's often, and by racialized I mean the process of identifying race as something. It's often like white people, which is interesting. Or immigrants. I have a friend who moved to Vancouver about the same time as me, and they came from the United States. Our experiences are very different. For example, this has happened 3 times so far, and I think it's funny. I went to the movie theater, and I show up, and I have my ticket on my phone, and they go to have me an Uber order. I thought that was like the weirdest thing. But my American friend who's white hasn't experienced those things. So yeah, it's just funny. It's those small moments about what it means to be racialized and to be seen as other. Why do we use these legal categories? I'll leave that as a question. And what does it mean to be multicultural? And what do the common stereotypes of Canadians say about race relations in Canada? So, for example, if you were here at the Black History Month talk, I spoke a lot about how there's these perceptions of Canada not having these problems, about us being different from the States. And I think it's important to interrogate that and question why those assumptions exist, even though it doesn't necessarily align with our history. For example, the comment, "I don't see race." So yeah, this is just the definition of visible minority. So yeah, again, it's a very legal definition, but it has a lot of implications because it's in our Employment Equity Act, and it's often how we view racialization. In addition, we also should also consider who becomes a visible minority, who moves out of those categories. There's this book called How the Irish Became White, and it's a very interesting book because it talks about Irish immigrants in North America and how they were heavily discriminated against, and how for a long period of time they were not considered white. Hogan's Alley, for example, was a predominantly black neighborhood. The term Hogan's Alley comes from a neighborhood in the United States that was Irish, and it was seen as a ghetto. So Hogan's Alley became a descriptor for impoverished neighborhoods, which by extension is how Hogan's Alley here got its name. So it's interesting, speaking about how some groups move in and out of these definitions. You've probably seen these terms: BIPOC, Black Indigenous People of Color, BIPOC, Indigenous Black People of Color, and POC. Why do we use these terms? Where do they come from? So I guess question 1, are these terms new? So people of color goes back a few hundred years, but BIPOC and IBIPOC are more recent. And I'll get into why in just a moment. But just a case study, when we talk about black people, oh yes, go ahead.
So first question, or can we interrupt for questions if you want?
Maybe just hold it till the end because we have 5-minute discussion periods for the Q&A. Thank you, I appreciate that. So using black as a descriptor, for example. So how did we get from Negro to color to black? Well, it was mostly generational shifts. Negro was in response to the really bad slur that I'm not going to say. Color was in response to people not wanting to be identified as anything close to that slur. And black became more of a collective and empowering term. That doesn't mean, it's going to stay black. There may be another term that comes up. But as it stands now, this is kind of how that shift has happened. And I guess my point here and the crux of this argument is that language is complex, and some terms that may seem dated can also be preferred. For example, some people who grew up during the Black Civil Rights Movement still prefer the term colored. There was the BC Association for the Advancement of Colored People. There was the Alberta Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And I was just in Calgary for a history talk. And yeah, the person who was speaking grew up during that era, and they referred to their movement as, getting rights for colored people. So it's very interesting seeing how that language evolves. Another example is the term Aboriginal. You're starting to see a shift, but some people still prefer to use the term Aboriginal because it indicates a stronger connection to the Crown's responsibility and relationship. This graph I think is interesting. It's from Google Trends, and it just shows the term BIPOC and the moment it started being used. So it's 0 to 100. 100 is when the term is most popular, and 0 is when it was least popular. So as you can see during the George Floyd protest in 2020, huge spike. And the reason for that was people just wanted to use a more inclusive term, and it was mostly done by younger people, mostly pushed online, and it just kind of became adopted as a inclusive term. But as I'll describe, it's a little tricky. So it's just very interesting how a term can enter our vocabulary so suddenly and just dominate. Like this graph is kind of surprising. If you want to do a deep dive into this, there's this New York Times article called "Where Did BIPOC Come From?" You can just Google it and it'll pop up. But there's a few quotes from it I just want to pull out. Oh, so here it talks about how the term people of color goes back to 1796. And it was, again, something used to describe a group of people and just like an easy shorthand. And at the bottom, it said, Black and Indigenous was added to kind of make sure that it was inclusive. I think the major purpose of that was for including voices that hadn't originally been heard, and they wanted to be included in the narrative. Darker skinned, Blacks, and Indigenous groups, so they can make sure that all the skin shades are being represented. This is Shermie Nelson, our art history prof at McGill. They say that the history of Black and Indigenous people in Canada calls for the distinction between them and other people of color. In some parts of Canada, mainly East Ontario, Indigenous people were colonized but not enslaved, she said, unlike Africans who were subject to chattel slavery everywhere. We understand that under colonialism, African and Indigenous people had very different experiences. To conflate everything into one is erasure, which is the very nature of genocidal practice. So there's many different perspectives on this and these terms. There's also a lot of confusion. I saw this tweet and I thought it was kind of funny. I was yesterday years old when I figured out that BIPOC actually does not mean bisexual person of color. So yeah, language is interesting. I think the point here is just to be flexible and be open to adapt, because history changes, culture movements change, and as long as you're not saying a slur, it's important to just be conscious of the language we use and why we use it. One final point, when we talk about racialization, Indigenous people are often excluded. For example, there's committees, there's anti-racism committees, there's committees focused on, many different topics, but in those committees, they often focus on visible minorities, at least in my experience. So it's important to talk about how Indigenous people are impacted by this process. And it's also important to know Indigenous people do not consider themselves minorities. Omitting Indigenous people from discussions on racialization and the impact of race can be harmful. To give an example, this is younger me, when I was with Black Lives Matter, and it said, we wanted to get data on carding. Carding is when people are stopped by police for no reason. And we could have just asked for data on Black people, but we asked for data on every group of people, and we found that Indigenous women were 6 times more likely to be carded, while Black people were 3 times more likely to be carded. So immediately we worked together. That's Rochelle. She's with a Indigenous women group in Alberta, and we worked together to push for carding to end, and we were ultimately successful. But again, if we didn't include that perspective, we would have been missing the group that was most impacted. And here's just some more information. So I just want to leave with the question, what do you see as the impact of this process, the impact of someone being racialized? There's a few examples. There's carding, employment discrimination, on-campus profiling, which I'll show here. Me and Davin were talking, and I mentioned reading a story of a Black student who was stopped on campus. And when I Googled it, there's actually 2 stories that happened separately a year apart. There was Shelby McPhee, who said, I felt embarrassed, and I felt there was not a safe place for me at UBC or for my colleagues that had come from the Black Canadian Studies Association. He said, I was an invited speaker, so my credibility was now called into question if I'm paraded as a criminal. So what happened was they accused him of stealing a laptop, and they asked a lot of very invasive things to him. But then this also happened a year after. This student, Savoy Williams, was also profiled on campus. So yeah, take a minute, a few minutes, take 5 actually, talk to the person beside you and just discuss this question. What do you see as the impact of what do you see as the impact of this process on not just people who are racialized, but everyone on the UPC campus and also in Canada? So yeah, just talk to the person beside you and jump into it. And we'll have questions at the end.
All right, everyone, on back from what sounds like some fruitful conversation. And I'm just going to switch up our format just a little bit and check in to see if anybody wants to share anything from their discussion, or if there's any burning questions that you want to ask now, or for anyone else, if anything kind of came up that you'd love to share with the group. We'd love to hear. If not, we'll save it for a later discussion. Any brave souls?
So I never have burning questions,
Oh, okay. I love it.
but I wanted to ask you, and you kind of addressed it, let's say you mostly addressed it, but might as well ask.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that colored people, it's derogatory, but people of color, it's not.
Yeah.
And it's language evolution, but I was curious, what I was going to ask you. Why? And I was curious, why?
Yeah, so many of a cop-out. I don't know why. But I think about that all the time, actually.
Oh, can I make a comment?
Oh, yeah.
I don't have the right English grammar language to say this,
Yeah.
but it's like saying a disabled person or a person with a disability.
Yeah.
So the entirety of that person is not one aspect of their identity, that's just a part of who they are.
So I'd asked my friend once, years ago, when I first heard the term, and he was like, well, they're person first versus colored first.
Yeah.
I hear it and like can accept that answer. It's still very semantic. It's a very semantic argument, which maybe that's just what it is. Maybe it's just the nature of language. Because to that point, you know, it was handicapped, now it's not good, right? And then it was disabled person, but now that's becoming not politically correct as well. That's just the nature of it. Maybe there's no answer. Maybe the answer is I don't know.
I'll just add to that a little bit. It's psychologically, so it's how people think of themselves, like so instead of like an evolution of language, I think it's understanding of psychology and understanding of how people would view themselves, how other people would view them. So I think it's not that language and terms change as much as we're just understanding how words are impacting people's psyche, their mind, and how they view themselves. So yeah, like viewing someone with a disability versus a disabled person is like, we would see, like, it's very subliminal, it's subconscious, we wouldn't even necessarily notice it, but, you know, they're someone with something, like I'm a person with a shirt on versus I'm a shirted person, like I only, it's a weird example, but yeah, I think it's based more in like psychology and studies and kind of subconscious.
Thank you for sharing. Anybody else want to add to that conversation?
I'd be curious to share a little bit. I think in my experience with marginalized communities that have been dehumanized for so long, and that has actually been stripped from them for both disabled people and people of color, that we would want to recognize, especially now, as a sense of like understanding of the historical context of these people, that they are people, and that's really important. So I think it's important to say people of color and have people first language, and that's the terminology in my experience that's used people first.
Thank you, people first language.
Yes.
And I think that's a really great point around dehumanization and how much it does matter to say you're a person first, and then this is a part of you, or this is something that you manage on a day-to-day basis, or this is how other people see you in the world, or this is how you see yourself. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. No? Does that kind of answer your
A great
question?
discussion. Doesn't answer it. It's definitely a good answer. It's still very eye-opening, I think. I'm sure that's like very one-sided.
And we just did have, sorry, did I want to frame it as a group norm that that was mentioned on break, is just, this is a space for learning and unlearning, but there's also room for grieving for folks who are personally affected by what we're talking about today. So if you need any support, please flag one of us down. We're happy to go and have a chat and support one-on-one so that we have both spaces here for everyone. So with that, Sarah, are there any comments from Zoom? If not, we'll move on.
We're okay to move on.
We're okay to move on. Okay, great. So I'll be chatting a little bit about the principles that can guide our work together. And this is setting us up for the beautiful chat that Dana Lynn is going to give later today on allyship. Our team looks at allyship as action or as behavioral and not as an identity as much, or certainly an identity to be claimed, perhaps an identity to be given by the community that you're working with. So these are some of the ways that we're thinking how we can set ourselves up to be responsible allies. I always feel a bit weird using that term, to be honest with you. I prefer a great community member or a caring community member, but for the sake of not being too semantic, we'll use allyship to your point. So yeah, just starting off with this idea of being in a community with care, acting with care with one another. A lot of anti-oppression work for those of us who come from privileged identities is coming up against the ways in which we have perpetuated harm, we continue to perpetuate harm, and inviting in both accountability but also self-compassion around coming to terms with that. Nobody said it was easy. But also inviting in some compassion for folks who are affected by the harm we've caused, and bringing in care for those who do come from lived experiences and continue to engage in all of this work. So starting from a place of compassion for ourselves and others. And in developing this culture of care, our team has come up with a few different principles that we use to guide our work. So humility, reflexivity, lifelong learning, and accountability. So we'll be talking about these today. And I know a few of you in the room might have already heard these, so apologies if it's a bit redundant. So first off is humility. And this helps us be lifelong learners, to acknowledge that we always have more to learn. We always have room to grow, to show up in better and more helpful ways. It allows us to be reflexive, to say, hey, I might have messed up. Let me take a look at my actions and what I might have done here, because I think I might have caused some harm. And it makes space to create some positive change. And cultural humility involves us acknowledging to ourselves, as well as to others, that we're learners about other people's experiences, that we don't come from a place of superiority, or that our worldview is better than another person's worldview. But there's room for everyone and their different cultural identities and points of view. So reflexivity is the process of examining our feelings, our reactions, our thoughts, our behaviors, and beginning to take accountability for them. So understanding the ways in which we influence the world or interact with the world and those around us. So a few questions that we can use in terms of reflexivity in our work together through anti-oppression, anti-racism, and EDII is, what's my motivation for doing this work? As a white woman, also working as an Indigenous engagement coordinator, what is my motivation for doing this work? It was one of the questions I was asked while I was doing my MA and writing my thesis is, why you? What's your role in this? And I think it brings up some interesting points to really reflect on why we're here and why we are interested in doing this work. In what ways do I perpetuate systems of oppression? What's my role in continuing these systems of power and oppression, and how do they affect me? How do they affect those around me? When someone identifies a way in which I've caused harm, how do I typically react? This is something that I'll talk about later this afternoon, but do I react with anger? Do I become super defensive? Do I shut down and freeze and not quite know what to say? Do I become really anxious and feel like I can never say anything ever again because I don't want to say something wrong? And yikes, that was really hard. So thinking through how we react and how we can show up a little bit differently. So in terms of lifelong learning, I think we all hopefully at a university are pretty big fans of this one. No matter whether we're an expert in a field or a new beginner learner in something, we always have something more to learn. And again, inviting in that humility to understand that we will never know everything. I like to share this semi-embarrassing anecdote that I was working for a First Nations organization right after I finished my degree in Indigenous politics, and I was kind of absent-mindedly listening to a podcast in the morning and was hearing Elizabeth Warren speak, and I walked in and said to my Indigenous colleague, I feel like Elizabeth Warren has some really great points. And for those of you who don't know, Elizabeth Warren pretended to be Indigenous and was not, and my Indigenous colleague said, yeah, I don't think I could really get behind her because of that. And yeah, it was pretty embarrassing, I'm not gonna lie, but it was a great reminder that we always have to be on top of the information that we're taking in, and there's always space to learn more and kind of correct course. And then accountability is really central to our work in anti-oppression. So when we do cause harm, how do we change our actions? How do we do better in the future? How can we take accountability in that moment or right afterwards and take real steps towards changing our beliefs and behaviors? Like I've mentioned, it's not easy to notice the ways in which we cause harm and we show up in ways that affect those around us. And it's really easy for our nervous systems to get dysregulated in those moments and to tense up or become angry or become anxious around those times of being called in or called out by our colleagues, our friends, and our family. And unfortunately, those big reactions or tensed up reactions don't really help our work. So that idea of being able to show up without defensiveness, to take accountability, to be humble, to be self-reflexive, is so important to our work together. So a little bit about harm and intent in terms of anti-oppression work. It's one of these gray areas. There's lots of balance here. So although our intent does matter, our actions do matter more. And it's great to be well-meaning, but well-meaning isn't always enough in order to create a better future. And it's okay to be well-meaning and still make a mistake. It doesn't mean you're a bad person, you're trying your best, but you can try in a different way that might be more supportive to those around you. Yeah. And like I mentioned at the beginning, and now we'll add as a group norm, is that as a community trying to do this work, we really do need to create spaces for us all to unlearn, to ask tricky questions. I've asked many a stupid question in my day, and I value having the space for people to educate me and to learn from people around me, but also learning how to ask those questions to myself, to the internet. It's a great tool if you think you're going to ask a bit of an offensive question to turn to a robot, basically. And like one of our community members mentioned, a space for grieving, a space that is separate from unlearning, where those questions can be quite harmful, actually, in many ways, where somebody might be asking somebody with lived experience to kind of be put in a position to defend their own humanity, which is pretty harmful in and of itself. So yeah, creating some of that balance for both of these things to exist in our work together. So the reflection question I'll ask you guys all to think about is, what do you think about these principles? Do any of them stand out to you? Are any of them personally meaningful to you? And yeah, I'll send that back to you guys and we'll come back in a few minutes to talk. Conversations unless everyone's talking about some sort of mess.